Hello, everybody joining us today for this webinar. We are still giving access to the participants in the virtual meeting room, and this will take a minute or two more. And so we will wait a little bit, and then we will start with the webinar in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar today on the international experience in environmental performance assessment tools and policies for the construction sector. A very warm good morning and welcome here from Brussels. My name is Oliver Rapf. I'm the Executive Director of BPIE, and I will be moderating and hosting this webinar today. And BPIE is organizing this webinar on behalf and in collaboration with the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil, with the European Commission, and with the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. And all three partners are collaborating in the International Partnership for the Implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is in the International Climate Initiative context, which the EU and Germany is operating together. So that's the organizational background. BPIE is a non-profit think tank based in Brussels, and we are working a lot with governments all over Europe, increasingly also outside Europe, and we're very honored to host this webinar and workshop today. We have a long list of highly experienced and knowledgeable speakers. We will have speakers from the Brazilian Energy Research Office, from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, from the European delegation to Brazil. We will have speakers from the Dutch National Environmental Database, from the Brazilian Sustainable Construction Council, from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the European Cement Association. And I hope I have not forgotten anybody, because as I said, it's a long list. You will hear from them in detail in a moment. Now, before we really go into the content and the context of this webinar, I just would like to run with you through some housekeeping issues. First of all, I would like to highlight that this webinar is being translated simultaneously. And if you want to choose either English or Portuguese, you should look for this little globe button at the very end of your screen, at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on it, you have three choices: either off, and you have no interpretation, or you can choose between English and Portuguese. Now, whatever you choose during the webinar, you will not have to change the channel. You will always hear the language which you have chosen. When there is a translation, it could well be that you hear the original a little bit in the background, but then the translator will come in very quickly. So no need to change the channel once you have made your original choice. And I hope this is working well. If there are any technical problems, maybe send us a quick chat in the chat box. The chat box is also the place where I would like to encourage you to send us any questions and comments you may have during the presentations. and also during the Q&A session and the panel discussion in the second half of the webinar. We will be collecting all your questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to address them as much as possible in the Q&A session later. And I don't know whether some of you already hear some background noise. That's another technical hint I would like to give you. Please always keep your microphone on mute when you are not speaking, and also your camera off while you're not speaking, simply to save some bandwidth and make sure that we have a good technical flow of the webinar as such. I also want to mention that this webinar will be recorded. So if you're not agreeing with this, you will unfortunately have to leave the webinar, but I hope this is not the case. We will make the webinar recording available online on the websites of the Ministry of Mines and Energy and on the BPAE website. And we will also share the presentations which you will see later today with you again online on the websites. And I think with that, I have hopefully covered all the technical instructions I wanted to share with you, and we can now go into the program and into the real content of today's webinar. We will first have 3 short keynote speeches from representatives from the EU delegation in Brazil and the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil and the Brazilian Energy Research Office. And after that, we will have a range of experts' presentations. I will introduce all the speakers in due time, and then we will have the Q&A session. In between, we will also have a short break of round about 10 minutes where you can grab a coffee or a glass of water or anything else. In any case, there will be a very short break because the webinar as such is quite long. We will spend about 2.5 hours together, and I hope you will be able to stay until the very end. But now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Stephanie Horel, who's the program officer at the European Union's delegation in Brazil. Stephanie is in charge of all the topics which have to do with climate and energy, and she will speak today about the EU's climate and energy targets and the role of the construction sector and all the plans the EU has in that regard. Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us today. If you could please switch on your camera and your sound, and I will hand over the virtual microphone to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm very pleased to be here with you. I'm here replacing my colleague Pedro, who is much more an expert than I am, as you mentioned in the introduction, on energy sector. As you said, I'm based here in Brasilia in the EU delegation, working on projects related to the EU Green Deal. And now, if you allow me, I would like to switch to Portuguese, as I understood that there is an English translation. Então, primeiro, agradecer o convite.
So, we are experiencing some technical issues.
Stephanie, sorry to interrupt. It seems there are some technical issues with the translation and the sound. Can I ask the translator whether you are fine now with the technical?
Mr. Oliver, I think Stephanie got cut off somehow. I'm checking here with the other translator, and in fact, we cannot receive any voiceover from Stephanie.
Okay. Then I suggest we simply switch the order of the speakers, and we are going to continue with Mr. Carlos Pires from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, if that is okay with you, Mr. Pires, and with Giovanni Mercado from the Energy Research Office, just doing some impromptu improvisation here, but I'm sure we will be able to get Stephanie back in a moment. So then I will formally introduce you as well, Mr. Pires. You're the Director of the Energy Development Department and a civil engineer with a degree from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And you are working and you are in charge of public policy and government management in the ministry. Mr. Mercado, you're an economist who holds a degree in energy planning, actually several degrees, not only one, and you're the Director for Energy Economics and Environmental Studies in the EPE. So thank you very much for joining us and for giving us the Brazilian perspective on the topic this afternoon. Mr. Pires, I will hand over the virtual microphone to you, and I hope that we won't have any further technical problems. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the welcome words, Oliver.
Obrigado pelas palavras de recepção. Bom dia do Brasil. É grande prazer abrir esse webinar with international experience in environmental performance assessment tools and policies for the construction sector.
Almost 40% of CO2 emissions come from buildings, and most of it is emitted while materials are being produced. In Brazil, buildings are responsible for 43% of all electricity consumed. In addition, there is a large housing deficit in our country, reaching almost 6 million households. Consequently, we need to be able to measure and quantify emissions with reliable and representative data from the industry,
com dados representativos da indústria,
for the policymakers. Today, we are going to share experience and information about European initiatives and tools related to life cycle assessment in the civil construction sector. No doubt, it is crucial to understand not only the potential to reduce GHG emissions, but also to address policies to improve and make our construction sector more efficient and competitive. Brazil is now facing a severe hydrological and energetic crisis, and most of our attention is in short-term issues to avoid blackouts and prepare the entire system for the post-pandemic demand of energy. On the other hand, we know that promoting the reduction of GHG emissions in the industry is directly related to a more rational and efficient way to consume energy. So we cannot miss the opportunity to enhance our institutional and knowledge framework to deal with these topics in the construction sector. Today, we are giving one more step forward to understand and use the tools we have in hand to do that. We, from the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Brazil, appreciate the chance to discuss with the experts and pave the pathway for a lower carbon economy. Thank you so much. And now I hand over to my colleague, Giovanni Machado from the Energy Research Office in Brazil.
Hello, everyone. I will turn to Portuguese now. Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Initially, I would like to thank you for the invitation by the IPAE, BPIE for the organization of the event. Also the Ministry of Mine and Energy, and also thank the partners when it comes to BIPA, the Strategic Partnership of Implementation of Paris Agreement, the very Ministry of Mines and Energy, European Union, the German Environmental Ministry for Nuclear Safety, and JASI, as well. The sector of civil construction is very important for the decarbonization of economies, not only for the use of energy in the very process of construction, but also for the relevance and the edifications when it comes to consumption of fuels and energy. Here in Brazil, the sector of edification consumes about 50% of the energy consumption in 2019, adding residential, commercial, and public sectors. The importance of the consumption of energy consumption has a contribution of when it comes to the consumption of power consumption during peak times due to the utilization of equipment such as electric showers, air conditioners, among others. Electric consumption was responsible for 70% of the consumption, while LGP corresponds to other 35% of consumption when it comes to energy. So edifications may apport almost 60% of total gains in energetic efficiency when it comes to use of electric consumption in the next 10 years, according to our estimates. For its importance in the institution of the law of energy efficiency, a series of energy efficiencies focused on edifications have been established, such as the Brazilian program of labeling of edifications through Eletrobras and Metro, the Procede FICA, the labeling of vehicles and edifications focusing on commercial edifications, civil and public, the labeling of residential edifications later, the MME edifications for efficiency goals, the seals of edification, among others. Such efforts of low level of carbon from the energy matrix in Brazil can have even wider effects and structural when it comes even to the effects of standards of edification standards along its lifespan when it comes to environment, temperature, and water, as both indirectly associated to carbon and materials and construction process, such as steel, wood, cement, etc. As it has been highlighted, this event gathers specialists and initiatives and tools for life cycles and European standards for civil construction, as well as the Brazilian tool has been developed for the BIP, the environmental information for the SIDAC. So I would like to thank again the participation of partners and specialists and the experience for exchange of information. I want to thank once again for everybody participating and the work of my team here at IPE. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Machado. I think we just had an overlay of another presentation just briefly, but thank you very much for your words and for explaining how important it is that Brazil conserves energy and of course addresses the issue with the energy supply. We of course in Europe have heard the news about the big droughts and the issues which are the consequences of that. I would quickly want to check whether we can have Stephanie Horel back now, but it seems that is not necessarily the case. If that's not possible, then we will simply move to the experts presentation, the expert session already now. And we can see whether we can have Stephanie Horel from the EU delegation back a little bit later, because I think to give you an overview of the European context is still very, very important. But in fact, our first speaker in this expert session will talk about the European approaches on life cycle assessment initiatives and what Europe and some of the European member states are doing to assess the impact of the whole life cycle carbon as such. Our next speaker is Scholl Todd. He's a senior project manager at our organization at BPIE. He is the lead author of a number of reports which we have published this year and which are all available on our website on the topic. So Scholl, I will hand over the floor to you and the virtual microphone as well, so that we get an impression what's happening on that in Europe before we move to the Brazilian situation and description.
It's true. Thank you very much, Oliver. Good morning to everyone. I think that's the most appropriate way to say hello, given our target audience. And it's true, I'm not going to claim I can sort of step in for Stephanie Morel, but I would at least try to provide a snapshot of the relevant EU policy landscape in terms of the whole life carbon emissions. And what probably Stephanie would have spoken about would have been that the EU has set really ambitious energy efficiency and climate targets. So my starting question, and you can already flip maybe to the next slide, please. So my starting question is, why do we actually need to look at whole life environmental impact of the building and the built environment? And where is actually the European regulation in this regard? So why do we have this topic at all today at this webinar? So we can fairly say that the focus of the industry and the policy over the last 20 years have been exclusively on reducing carbon emissions from the operation of the buildings. And this is undeniably a very, very important issue, and it still will be over the next 20 and 30 years. But what about all the upfront emissions? What about all the emissions that are already hidden in the construction products and the construction materials, which reach the construction site even before the construction even begins? So what you can see on this slide is essentially buildings built to quite ambitious standards today. They have a split of about 50% of their carbon emission coming from the use phase, coming from the operation of buildings. And the remaining 20% is these hidden emissions, the embodied carbon sort of captured in the materials and the products which go into the building. But as the EU is going to progress towards more and more ambitious energy efficiency and carbon standards, we see that that this split will be half. So it will be essentially 50-50 split, 50% coming from the use of the buildings and 50% coming from the embodied emissions. So that means that the importance of embodied emissions is going to raise dramatically. And we heard from the previous presentation of Mr. Pires that essentially there is a huge amount of construction that is needed to make sure that there is a supply of buildings and dwellings. So there is a huge amount of new construction is going to be expected. So the amount of carbon released from the construction materials and construction products is going to be very important. And maybe there's another very important aspect why we speak today about whole life carbon is that all the mitigation strategies to tackle embodied carbon is happening now. So all the carbon release is happening in a short burst of time. And whereas with operational carbon, it's something that can be mitigated over the lifetime of the building. With embodied emissions, it's something that is happening in a very short period of time, just at the moment of the construction. So that is very important because we are essentially using up our remaining carbon budget, and is essentially limiting the amount of mitigation measures that we will have later on to do. Can we have the next slide, please? Right. So here you can see that there's a plethora, there's a huge range of policy initiatives and policy measures already in place. They are targeting whole life carbon emissions from the buildings. But the issue here, what you can also see, that there is not much consistency. So policy making is happening in silos. But what is very important with addressing whole life carbon in buildings is this level of consistency. It's the importance of whole life carbon, which in a way it remains unregulated unless the European Commission is going to move very quickly to review the key pieces of legislation. Can we have the next slide, please? Right, so here you can see that beyond the European framework, there are a number of national initiatives coming from Europe. And some of these either addressing mandatory life cycle assessment for new buildings like the ones in France, like the ones in the Netherlands, or in Denmark for that, for example. But there are others which are targeting public buildings through public procurements. So I think this is signaling a very clear trend that the member states in Europe are moving forward to regulate this, but they are also providing a good practice example that essentially regulating whole life carbon is possible. And it's also something that it's worthwhile to pursue. Can I have the next slide, please? Essentially, I just want to give an example of one country, which is Denmark, because I know that later on we will hear about the example of the Netherlands, which can be considered very much a best practice case in that example and one of the most advanced countries in terms of requiring whole life carbon assessments and benchmarking. So I just brought up the Danish case because I think it can be an example of how other countries could go ahead also with putting whole life carbon regulation in place. And essentially what you see here is that they have an incremental approach. So they started off with a preparation phase. They started off with requirements to collect data and to disclose, to assess, to report whole life carbon. And once the data is being built up, then, and it's of sufficient quality, the government is going to set embodied carbon caps, embodied carbon targets at a later stage. And as we see, as the market is actually catching up with this regulation, the requirements will be tightened gradually. Can I have the next slide, please? So when it comes to actually to a blueprint of how the policy framework should ideally be designed to be able to cater for whole life carbon requirements, we see that we need essentially policies and measures to be in place at market level, at the material and the product level, as well as the building level. So today we are going to talk mostly about product and material level policies, but in a way that they are the building blocks for them being able to assess and quantify and optimize whole life carbon performance at the building level as well. So in a way, product level policies and product level emissions cannot be regulated alone. First of all, we will need to make sure that there is a market demand for this. This is also very important to avoid that there are no carbon leakage and there is no undue burden placed on certain parts or sectors within the industry. And it's also very important that we will have the right sort of incentive chain across the whole value chain within the construction sector, which we all know that is quite fragmented today. So can I have the next slide, please? And this is my concluding final thoughts as well. So essentially, these are some key messages, which I'm sure that the other speakers are going to pick up on later on. Essentially, I just wanted to say that because in Europe, there are many energy efficiency measures which are now so ambitious that the low-hanging fruits, the cost optimality the cost-effective measures have already been taken. So it makes economic sense that the construction value chain is looking for actually reducing carbon emissions and finding solutions from within the embodied carbon sector, simply because these are going to be the low-hanging fruits. And we all know that data availability and accuracy is a critical issue. And it's not just for measuring and optimizing the carbon budget of buildings, but also for policymakers, because they are the ones who then will be able to set up the benchmarks and the targets, and they will need to make sure that there is a proper enforcement and compliance. However, we cannot use this as an excuse. We need action. First, we need action today. We need to start somewhere. We need this more than sitting there and waiting for the perfect data to come. And essentially what we can see from the best practices from across Europe is that most of these countries have been starting off with an incremental approach. So they started off with reporting requirements, gradually built up the benchmarks, set the target values, started with voluntary measures to build capacity, and then with full regulation. So I will stop here because others will probably develop on this in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scholt, for giving us this snapshot of the European situation and some examples from the European member states, how this whole topic of whole life carbon and life cycle analysis is managed. I just wanted to encourage everybody in the audience to send us any questions you may have in the chat box. You can find the chat box at the very bottom of your screen. If you hover with your mouse over the bottom of your screen, this should come up easily, and we will be collecting all the questions for the Q&A session later and for the panel discussion later. And so we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask anything which might be unclear, or where you want to go into some more details, or where you might disagree and would like to start a discussion. So don't be shy, don't hesitate to send us any questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to collect them and answer them. And I also wanted to say again that there is a simultaneous presentation. Also at the very bottom of the screen, you have a little symbol of a globe, and there you can select either the English or the Portuguese channel so that you have the simultaneous translation. If you do this once, you will not have to switch it during the webinar. Your chosen language will then be the one you will hear either in the original or in the translation. I would now like to welcome our second expert today, who's Roland Hunziker, who's the Director of Sustainable Buildings and Cities at the WBCSD. And WBCSD is the acronym for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a business organization. But I know, Roland, you will talk about what WBC is doing in more detail in a moment. Roland holds an MBA from INSEAD in France, and also an MA in History and Political Science from the University of Zurich in Switzerland. You're a Swiss national, and I'm very happy that you can join us this afternoon. I hope everything is going to be fine with the sound and the microphone, and I'm handing over the virtual microphone to you now. Thank you for joining us, Roland.
Thank you, Oliver, very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and this distinguished audience. It's actually exciting to be just after Zolt, because you will probably hear me say many of the same things, but from a different perspective, obviously from the work we do at the WBCSD, but really enforcing and supporting what we have just heard from Zolt. So the importance of the whole life approach. Next slide, please. So as Oliver said, I'm the director for the built environment work at the WBCSD. We're a global member-led organization. You can see here about 200 companies are in our membership. And we have developed Vision 2050. And this year we updated it. We did a refresh of our Vision 2050. And it really talks about that market transformation that needs to happen across different systems: food, built environment, transportation, energy. and how we as a business network can support that transition. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with this work, to have a look at our Vision 2050 Time to Transform. Next slide. This is supporting what Joel said before. We need to look at the built environment as a system, as we call it. 40% of global emissions are generated through this built environment system, from the usage, from the development of buildings and infrastructure. And on the left-hand side, you see that today, 70% is energy related, and about 30% is embodied carbon from materials and construction processes. But in new builds, we've also heard, this can be 50-50 because energy efficiency legislation or simply practices have picked up very much in the last few years. And it's also important because there are trade-offs. We should not reduce, on the one hand, let's say the pink part of the chart, to the detriment of increasing the emissions from the blue, which is the materials, or vice versa, reducing embodied carbon, but then having buildings that consume more energy. So we need to have that holistic approach. And we know today, based on IPCC and that renewed urgency, that we need to at least have by 2030 the emissions from this system. So embodied carbon, carbon that is upfront emitted, needs to go down by at least 40%, better 50%. And we have to be net zero in operation. That means buildings that in their consumption of energy are efficient and do no longer emit any carbon. Next. Last year, we issued the System Carbon Framework, which looks at how can this value chain that you see here, how can all these organizations work together to reduce the emissions? Because the blue circle is where emissions happen, and the green are influencer organizations. So the architects and designers, the developers, and very importantly, the investors have an influence over the whole life carbon of what they finance and develop. And obviously, regulation, that's the topic of today, how regulation can drive this whole life reduction. And on the bottom right, you see the framework, and I'll go briefly into this in the next couple slides. Next. We issued in July a new report based on the Building System Carbon Framework and with the help of Arup to develop 6 case studies. So 6 buildings, you would say, well, that's nothing. But actually the work was very hard to do, even on Arup-owned projects, to get all the data. And we believe this report is important because it really shows us how we need to measure and report the data, that we are consistent, and that we start looking at these targets that we need to set in all projects and how we collaborate to achieve them. So very much strengthening the argument also made by Joel in moving really to a full life cycle approach towards net zero. Next. Just a few more technical information on this report. You can see we have taken the Building System Carbon Framework, which is basically putting 2 charts over each other. We have the whole life cycle stages in the EN 15978 in the middle, which shows us the life cycle of a building. And on the right-hand side, you can see how a building is made up from structure to facade and stuff. And how do we account for all the emissions across these dimensions? That's what the system framework does. Next. Assumptions matter, but not to the point, and again, very much like the conclusion of Joel, not to the point where we have to be precise on the last digit, but be transparent about those assumptions that we are making. What are we considering for transportation or for the lifespan of elements or the whole building? That's important. And the report gives an example of how that has been done and applies it consistently to these case studies. And the similar for the decarbonization of the grid. This is an example from the UK. So simply taking that and using it as a proxy for the calculations that have been done. Next. This is one example output of such a case study. So you can see the building stages and then the layers, and simply accounting transparently for all the emissions. And you can see on the right, there is a column beyond life. That's D. This is today not agreed on how to assess it, how to use it in LCA, but it is there to show and could support in the future potential circular economy strategies to reduce the emissions in the bottom right corner to net zero. Next. Now, the report tries to provoke as well to say, well, we could set ourselves, based on today's knowledge, we could set ourselves clearer targets, absolute targets. On the left, we see embodied carbon targets. So you see on the left, business as usual, roughly 1,000 kilograms per square meter, CO2 per square meter. But also the case studies show significantly lower embodied carbon. And there's some benchmarks. LETI is in the UK, GLA as well, the London GLA, they're starting to set benchmarks. We've just seen it from the Danish example as well. So could we set benchmark of 400 kg for upfront carbon? And the same in energy use intensity targets. Could we actually set targets of 50 kilowatt hours per square meter, comparing that to a business as usual, or even some of these 2025 targets that you see here on this chart? So by being clearer about the data, having that whole life cycle accounting, we can then also discuss the feasibility of these targets. Next. In summary, we need to measure more, we need to share data openly, and this report comes with a call to action to our members, to many other building stakeholders out there. Do send us case studies if you have on whole life carbon approach. And we need to start setting clear targets. On net zero, there is currently a discussion ongoing. What is a valid net zero claim? And there will be guidance coming out later this year on how do we start driving really towards net zero. But there's a lot we can do already today with existing technology and practices. And we will present this in the Climate Week if you are interested to join the formal launch of the work. Lastly, next slide. I just wanted to mention one other piece of work, which is more directed at the investors. So again, looking at the value chain, the very important role of investors and developers as demand side players, but this could equally apply to a city, a national government through its procurement strategies, is how can you set requirements at the very earliest stage of projects to integrate embodied carbon. And it's a practical report that shows about 50 different requirements that can be set. There are no regrets requirements, and that can really drive this conversation as well. With that, I would like to thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion we'll have later on with the other panelists. Thank you, Oliver.
Roland, thank you very much for giving us these case studies and already highlighting the difficulty of getting reliable data. I'm quite impressed about the analysis you have done here. We'll dive into some of the details later. I'm sure there will be questions, and we're already getting some questions here in the chat, which is great. And I just wanted to say again, feel free to write your question either in English or in Portuguese, not a problem. We have people who are translating it in the background, so it will be captured. Just feel free and to use whatever language you're comfortable with. Well, limited to the two choices of Portuguese or English today in this webinar. The way we have designed this webinar and the series of experts' presentations is just not arbitrary. We have actually said, well, we should go from a higher level perspective to more detailed perspectives. And that's the flow of the expert presentations, which you will hear. So the next speaker now is Wagner Maringolo, who is with the European Cemburo, which is the European Association of the Cement Manufacturers. But in fact, Mr. Maringolo is a Brazilian national and has just joined the European Association only a few years ago as the Sustainable Construction Manager. You are originally a geologist from the Institute of Geosciences of Sao Paulo University, of course, in Brazil. And so it's great to have you here because you obviously have the experience of both the European Union and Brazil. And I'm very much looking forward to your presentation about what environmental product declarations and life cycle analysis actually mean for the construction sector and how they can be used for decision-making and environmental improvement. And I would like to hand over the virtual microphone to you, Mr. Maringolo. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Oliver. And good afternoon to everyone. Well, as being said, I'm very glad to have been invited to join this exchange here. As I worked for a long time for the Brazilian Cement Association. Now, next, please. I have joined Sambiro. Please, the next slide. Can you hear me? Okay. So I joined Sambiro 13 years ago. Sambiro, as you can see in this graph, has a large representativeness of the European cement industry in Europe, and also counts on corporations and also a membership from countries outside Europe, like Turkey and Ukraine. So please, the next one. So, well, I find the sequence of this event quite appropriate. I think it's interesting to be a representative of the European cement and also, well, concrete in a way. And I'd like to start by saying that the cement and concrete industry takes very seriously this responsibility to reduce upfront CO2 in construction. And bearing in mind this responsibility, Sambiro published last year its roadmap through 2050 climate neutrality, taking this approach along the value chain of cement and concrete. Cement is a very difficult sector to abate CO2 alone, but this neutrality can be reached if we have the whole value chain together and each part taking its measures to reduce CO2. This links to Sambiro's position, which aligns with the most of the other construction manufacturers in Europe, in that the environmental assessments should be done at the building level rather than at product level. So as the pictures here show, we take, and it is in fact, the construction products are intermediary products to a final product, just like the pieces of a washing machine. And in the end, it's the washing machine which is evaluated for its energy efficiency, for instance, also should be the final product, the building or construction work that should be evaluated for its environment. Next, please. The environmental product declarations have a key role in all this that I have just said. So Sambiro has also been a great and one of the first supporters of producing EPDs for cement. The first EPD for an average cement in Europe was already back in 2008. And last year, we published the updated EPDs for the three major cement types in the European market. And this can be downloaded from our website. So we have always trusted EPDs to be the source of environmental information that the market needs for decisions about the whole project, construction project. Next, please. So this is just a scheme to show how an EPD is formed, actually. EPDs are based on a life cycle assessment, which is also following product category rules. These product category rules are a set of parameters that actually guarantees that the life cycle analysis and the EPG for the same product group are assessed in a consistent manner. Next, please. So this is based on the life cycle assessment. As you might well know, the life cycle assessment is an evaluation of the environmental impacts of a product from the extraction of raw materials through the end of its useful life. So, which is called the cradle, and the last stage, the grave. Usually, environmental product declarations for constructed products are take actually the stages from the extraction to the gate of the factory. So it's called usually the scope as cradle to gate. And if it includes transport, it goes from cradle to site. Next, please. Well, the previous one was just to show, there was one before, it's just to show the scheme that is used in the cement EPGs that you can check in our EPGs that are available. Next, please. So this is a very simple figure to show the flow of information on how an EPG is produced. So you get the manufacturer's data of the process with all the inputs, the materials that were used, the energy that was consumed, and outputs, the products, the wastes, and the emissions to the air, water, and land. This will make up and will produce a life cycle inventory that in the end will become environmental burdens on which some categorization factors are applied, which will give some figures in quantitative figures that will form the EPGs. Next. These figures are not so easy, or maybe not easy at all, to a layman that would do not know exactly what they mean. So actually the EPGs are meant to provide information for professionals that are related to life cycle analysis of a product. So EPGs are not actually meant to be used for comparisons at product level, but actually to provide information for an LCA. Next, please. So how these EPGs are taken up in the European Union? There are several certification schemes, and the three of the major ones are here from the UK, BREEAM, for Germany, DGNB, and the US, LEED, which use EPGs as a source of information. There's also levels, which is not a certification scheme, but actually aims at being incorporated in these schemes, which is a framework that was recently launched by the European Commission for sustainable buildings. And I'll speak a little more about that. Next, please. So this, I wanted to show the relevance of having an EPG for these certification schemes. For instance, DGNB, from 190 points of environmental criteria that are required, 120 can be actually taken from EPGs, which means that 63% of the environmental assessment could be taken from EPGs. Next, please. This also shows the relevance of having the assessment at the final product, at the building level. Because you see here, for instance, how an EPG, for instance, for cement, is used as input for the environmental assessment for this certification scheme. In the case is DGNB. So you see that the cement has a very strong environmental footprint, but you can see in the flow that this impact is diluted along the time. And in the whole assessment of sustainability, does not take only the environmental performance, but also the assessment of economic and social performance in consideration. So the EPD shows once more the importance for the input to these certification schemes. Next, please. Well, this is just to exemplify a case in Sweden, and also to highlight that in Scandinavian countries, EPDs are taking almost as a mandatory for construction projects. In this case, it's a residential project, which actually carried out an LCA to decide on whether wood or concrete should be used in terms of global warming potential. And the result was actually that the LCA showed that in the end, both of them do not have such big differences in terms of their potential. So once again, the importance to have the assessment at the project level, the building level, and not at the project level. Next, please. Next. Yeah, and then one more, a little more about levels. Levels is this framework for sustainable buildings that the European Commission put forward a few years ago. Sunbureau had 3 pilot projects by cement and concrete companies, Heidelberg Cement, CRH, and Holcim. And these projects were really successful ones to test this framework. And EPDs were, for cement and for concrete, were fundamental for us to have our assessment of this framework. And it's important to say that the levels is being used now in the EU for green public procurement, and also to the sustainable finance framework. So the relevance of EPDs behind the system is quite easy to see. So finally, just as takeaways from this presentation, next, please. I'd like to come back to the fact that the EPDs are extremely useful to serve the market needs with detailed and verified environmental information, and they are meant to business professionals that are dealing with LCAs. The EPDs provide transparency information, and they are not to be used for comparisons at product level, or not even on individual indicators that are there. And the true assessments can be achieved only in the context of the full construction lifecycle. These are my takeaways, and glad to take part in the debate later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview. And later in the discussion, I would actually like to cover a little bit the question, well, what is driving environmental product declarations in Europe? I think we should talk about that a little bit and explain that to the audience, how this tool was actually established. But we'll come to that later in the panel session. For now, I would like to thank you. And as I said earlier, we will go into more detail throughout the presentations of the experts. And I'm very happy to welcome now 2 presenters in one go, John Drissen and Tom de Boer, who are both from the Dutch National Environmental Database. And they will introduce that environmental database. They will talk about the structure, the governance, the business model, so everything that is needed to set up and make this database operational. And then Tom de Boer in particular will also talk about its application, how it's being used. And so I'm very happy that the 2 of you can join us today. I hope you are there. If you could please switch on your camera and your microphone, then we will start with the presentation. I think, John Drissen, you are the first to start, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have Tom de Boer. John, are you there? I can currently not hear you, unfortunately.
Hello.
Yes, now I can hear you and I can see you. Wonderful. And we can
hear me, Oliver?
Yes, yes, now I can hear you. Thank you very much. And we have your presentation on the screen.
Okay.
So please go ahead. Thank you again for joining.
Yeah, sorry, my excuses for the complication with the sound, but okay. Thank you, Oliver. I'm a very pleasure to be here with you and the audience. I'm speaking now from the beautiful and today sunny The Hague in the Netherlands. My name is John Driessen, account manager at the Foundation Nmd, and together with my colleague Tom de Boer, we will tell you about the structure, governance, and the business model of the Nmd Foundation and the application of the environmental database. Next. Next. And to start, let me tell you about the Netherlands context. A slide before, please. Calculate over the entire life cycle, buildings in the Netherlands are responsible for 40% of the total CO2 emissions and energy consumption, 11% of the total CO2 emissions through material production, also the 30% of the waste production through materials production, and 25% of the road traffic is construction related. This brings us to a long road to buildings decarbonization in the Netherlands. Next. That is started back in 2006 with the environmental building regulation. In 2011 came the assessment of building with the EN 15978 norm and the first determination method. Then there came the publications, the EN 15804, and in 2018, the obligatory environmental performance of buildings was mandatory in the Netherlands, and we call it in the Netherlands the Dutch MPG. Last, in 2020, the Nmd is established as an independent organization. As a context, we were before the SBK, a construction quality foundation. It was a kind of authority and keeper of the database and determination method. And we had to split to be independent and objective in the Dutch market of construction materials. Since these years, it is mandatory a EPB of 0.8 euros by square meter by year to have a building license for housing, for example. And for offices, it has to be €1 by a square meter a year. As soon as possible, we will start to make APD mandatory to our building functions. Also, we will update the determination method with 19 indicators instead of the 11 we have now. Also, we will have the quality guarantee law that will become to control the delivery of finished buildings. In 2030, we expect to at least reduce 40% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions in comparison with the 1990 levels. And we expect to at least the reduction of 32% of share for renewable energy, at least 32.5% of improvement in energy efficiency, to finally, in 2050, to make a circular building environment in the Netherlands. Next. The Nmd is established as an independent organization to manage and maintain the determination method and the associated database. We are responsible to keep an uniform assessment method based on the LCA and the EU norms. We have the storage of reliable LCA environmental data on a central database hosted as an independent organization. We work in construction with market parties and government. We do the comparison of buildings, and we don't do the comparison of products. We're an organization of a transparent and verifiable system. And we aim to have a level playing field for all involved parties. Next. Like I said before, our common goal is to make in 2050 a circular building environment in the Netherlands. Next. The structure of the Nmd Foundation is as follows. We're a small company with a big responsibility. Like I said before, we were before the SBK, a construction quality foundation. It was a kind of authority and keeper of the database and determination method. We had to split to be independent and objective in the Dutch market of construction materials. We're directed by a board of directors. We have our CEO, Jan-Willem Groot. Then we have the staff of managers and professionals specialized in construction, building regulations, products, and environment as specialists in LCAs and APD too. We work in construction in consultation with market parties and government. We do this through two committees. The one committee is the policy committee that we call BMMNL, and the technical content committee that we call the TIC. Those committees give advice to the Nmd Foundation. Next. The Policy Committee, Environmental Performance Calculations in the Netherlands, the first one, is represented by three groups. One group is the contracting authorities that brings out public and private tenders, for example. The second group is the Nmd data users that are the architects, engineers, building contractors, and owners of the calculation softwares. And the third group is the Nmd data suppliers, like the manufacturers of building materials, suppliers, and branch organizations. Then, on the right part of the slide, we have the TIC, the Technical Content Committee. It is an advice committee consisting of two groups, the LCA experts, and the second group is in the environmental performance of building experts like construction experts and developers of calculations tools. I have to say that the government, through a representative of the Ministry of Interior, is also invited to attend the committees. Next. Now I show you this graphic to tell you in conclusion that the Nmd Foundation works through a public-private process, starting by the establishing building regulations and keeps a product database and the national determination method to make possible the building environmental performance needed by a building license. In these graphics, you see a top-down process starting by the government with two functions, one as a regulation maker, but also as a tender maker. From down to top, you see process from the building product market that makes an APD and LCA. Both processes comes together at the Nmd. Data of building products will be stored in the Nmd database and constructions objects through the environmental performance of buildings by building licenses, but also by the selections of public tenders through the most economically advantageous tender, where the economic impact of the environment plays an important role in the contracting process. Next. Now I'll give you the word to my colleague, Tom de Boer.
Yes, thank you, John. My name is Tom de Boer, and I'm one of the data managers at the Dutch Environmental Database, or also called National Environmental Database, and I will give you some insights in the structure and application of the determination method and the database itself. In this figure, you can see what the relation is between the determination method, LCAs, the database, And finally, the environmental performance calculation. This figure makes clear that the determination method is based on a European norm that was previously mentioned by John. It's the norm for making LCAs in the construction sector. And based on this norm, we formulated a more Dutch-specific method in order to allow realistic results for Dutch products and product application in the Netherlands. And this method is like a PCR for LCA and EPDs that can be entered in the database. The determination method also prescribes a verification protocol, which is a protocol that is used by verifiers of LCA data. So this verification is done before data entry can take place. And after verification, we see that we get 3 types of data in the database, which are manufacturer-specific data based on brand-specific products. It's also possible for branch organizations or
É possível que grupos de fabricantes e empresas insiram dados que sejam verificados para conseguir acessados na base de dados. Em terceiro, tem uma categoria de dados que a gente, na verdade, a gente configura e gerencia nós mesmos para tornar possível, para sempre podemos calcular um prédio inteiro, um trabalho de construção, para calcular o desempenho ambiental disso tudo. Se não existir dados disponíveis para fabricantes ou grupos de fabricantes, a gente entrega esses dados para algum cálculo para proprietários para tornar possível, a partir de regras que a gente gerencia para calcular o desempenho ambiental desses trabalhos de construção. Além disso, a gente pode extrair também materiais com dados para tornar possível, por exemplo, ver quantos materiais secundários foram usados no produto e se baseando nisso, esses tipos de parâmetros nos permitem calcular semelhanças. Então, basicamente, são o segundo grupo de possibilidades de cálculos. A gente vê aqui uma lista que foi mostrada pelo palestrante anterior. Essa é uma lista de impactos de categoria, de formas de ACV. Em total, a gente tem 9 indicadores. Colocando uma pontuação aqui, então a gente coloca fatores de
different kind of outcomes in one and the same unit, which is euros. And this makes it possible to get a single score indicator and make it possible to compare the impact of products, but more importantly, to sum these scores up to make it able to calculate the environmental performance of the whole construction work. Next slide, please. This is an overview of some of the things that John previously mentioned and my additions to it. So on top of this figure, we see that LCA data is coming from different types of sources and is translated into different categories of data. And it's collected in the Nmd, the database. And this data can thereafter be used in different kind of applications. On the left-hand side, we see that building licenses are granted by making use of this data and setting a certain limit in building regulation to see whether a developer of a project, a building project, complies with this. A second application is green procurement. So especially in the infrastructure sector, this is used to give some, how to call it? Well, to make it possible at least to compare different kind of organizations that subscribe to certain tenders, to compare them based on environmental scores. Subsidies are granted based on the sustainability of certain products or circular buildings. So that's the third application. It's also used in BREEAM, like the previous speaker already mentioned. And we also have a Dutch organization that makes use of this, the BREEAM-NL. And lastly, it will be used for quality regulations in the future, probably from 2022 on. Next slide, please. Finally, well, I said I've summed up some characteristics of our business model. We're not a business actually, but we're more like a foundation. So we're not for profit. We mainly get our income from subsidies from the government, the national government. And besides this, we get some income from the sale of the licenses to make use of our data. Well, if we look at the cost side of this, we obviously have some fixed costs because we have a fixed staff and we have a database and a server and all that kind of things that come with an IT platform. And besides this, we also do some advisory work based on our data and our expertise on the determination method. And this is also something that we can sell, basically. The main activities of that are IT related are outsourced at the moment. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide I would like to show to you. This is an overview of the revenues and the percentages that are that come with that. So, well, like I said, main of our income comes from subsidies, and besides this, there are some licenses income and services income. Yes, next, please. This is the really last slide. We are not going to show you this video, but it's a video available on our website in English that gives an overview of what we just told. So you can watch it on our website or on YouTube. Yeah, next. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope, and with me, John, I guess that you learned something from this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for this great overview, what's happening in the Netherlands. I actually watched your video earlier in preparation of this event, and I can really only recommend to everybody to watch it. It's in English. Unfortunately, it's not translated in Portuguese, but I think you may have been surprised that it may find its way all the way to Brazil. But nevertheless, I'm posting the link to the video in the chat right now for everybody to have a look after this webinar. Just out of curiosity, could you tell me how many people are currently employed in your organization? What's the staff size? What do we have to imagine? How many people does it actually take to run such a national database?
We're in a small organization and a young organization also. We started as a foundation just more than 1 year ago, and now we are about 10 people running in the business. And about half years we were only 6 people. Then I came for 3-4 months ago to enjoy the club. And as in a short time, there will be 2 or more people enjoying us to work in the infrastructure projects, and then we will be up 10 people big. Okay,
thank you. But of course, you have a lot of collaborators and contributors from the industry which are working with you and providing you with the data and the information which you are then processing.
Yes, of course. We do a lot of research that we do not in-house. We have to contract other companies to do the research of our own projects, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. There might be some more questions later also on your structure, not only on the work which you're doing, but we'll keep that for the Q&A session. I would now like to welcome our last speaker in the expert series, who is Professor Vanderlei John from the Brazilian Sustainable Construction Council. He's a professor of building materials at the Polytechnic School at the University of Sao Paulo, and he's a member of the board of the Brazilian Sustainable Construction Council. Professor John, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, well, this morning in Brazil. And I'm very much looking forward to your presentation about the Brazilian situation and the Brazilian experiences so far with managing carbon in the construction sector. I hope we can see your presentation soon, because you will have to share your screen. That's what we have agreed before. At the moment, I don't see it yet. I don't see your screen.
Sorry,
I can see you on camera.
Eu não entendi que eu ia compartilhar a tela, mas eu vou compartilhar. Eu fui instruído a aguardar.
I didn't understand I would have to share my screen, but I will share. Just a moment, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, if you share your screen, then you will be in full control of the slides. And hopefully that is going to work.
Ok. Ok, pessoal. Bom dia. Obrigado, Oliver, pela apresentação. Desculpa pela...
Good morning, guys. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry for the minor confusion here in the PowerPoint. We'll then present what we have been doing here in Brazil and our journey. What is SIDAC? It's a tool we are developing at present, which will allow for companies, Brazilian companies, incorporate the environmental variable in the everyday decisions, and even use the same variable in the SDG systems. Why are we doing this? I will repeat it, as few of us have any doubts regarding the seriousness and the impact of climatic changes in our lives. Climatic changes is not something for the future, it's something present here. Civilization in California surrounded by fire, which is the result of a drought. And a record all-time temperature raise in the region, and we're preparing ourselves for a lack of electric energy due to the lack of rains in Brazil. So the results are all there. There's a consensus, and I will cite here The Economist, in which if nothing is done, if we keep on doing the way we're doing, we'll raise to 3 degrees of temperature rise, and nobody's safe. It's everybody, individuals' interest and a mitigation action regarding the CO2 emissions. It's also a global problem.
De muitos países em desenvolvimento não está.
It is also a global problem because the Brazilian population has not mobilized itself in relation to climate change, and many people think that politicians will continue without doing anything. So this slide shows the international pressure. It will be significant. The market has already been reacting. We have the introduction in the Brazilian market of new technologies to combat carbon. We have the CLT. We have startups like this one here that are in the market now. And in other markets, we can look at low carbon footprints in relation to concrete. And we can see an example here of concrete that is commercialized with 70% less CO2 than the standard concrete, and also offers the possibility for neutralization. And carbon will also be a cost. 3 or 4 years ago, not many economists agreed that the carbon tax was a good idea. Today, the International Monetary Fund and the economists even agree that a tax for carbon is necessary. And in Brazil, this is being talked about and it is necessary. So here, these are some documents I have received over the last 2 weeks, and they show opportunities for low carbon technologies, green investments. The carbon market is being discussed by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development here in Brazil. And we are thinking about these low carbon constructions and how these can be done. So why is SIDAC important? Because today we do not have reliable data in Brazil, especially at a level of the manufacturers. And there is a significant different impact, carbon footprint impact, 200, 300, 400% difference between different manufacturers. We don't have accessibility to this data. And the international methodology, which was very clearly presented by my colleagues, it's very complex and would not be accessible to small and medium Brazilian companies. So if I want to motivate the manufacturers to have a low CO2 footprint and be more present in the market, I need high quality data. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but this needs to be more precise. So SIDAC is a simple tool, but it's very powerful because it's focused on the priorities, on what concerns us, the carbon footprint and the cumulative energy footprint. This is the priority, and this is what we've been able to do with not a lot of investments in the short term. And in the future, we can broaden this. This can grow. We can think of an evolution. This is perfectly aligned with the criteria of the evaluation of life cycle, the philosophy here about the life cycle and the impact of buildings and construction as a whole. So it is just a more limited scope, and it's quite simple, actually. We have the manufacturers who have the energy input, and they collect and insert data in SIDAC, which is a system that will process this. And within this process, which is similar to any global process, the specialists will evaluate this, and then the data will be published. So the clients can look at this. We will also automatically publish the manufacturer's declaration on the product and an integration channel with the BIM, as well as something that nobody has right now, which is a market benchmark for each product. So since the beginning, we will present to consumers what is the range of CO2 and energy expected for a specific product in the Brazilian market. And this will make the consumer more aware about their decision power. So what will people use this SIDAC data for? To select manufacturers, which I think is the most important thing. They can use this also for companies and sectors. We believe in continuous improvement. So seeing this potential for improvement and possible positive competition as well. And we also think this will influence public policies and purchases. Our advantage is that we are 100% digital. The Brazilian data here is verified and free, accessible to everyone. So we will also put in evidence the difference between different manufacturers. So we will make it clear when a manufacturer does not have an EPD for their product, and therefore a person cannot know what the footprint is for their building in a situation like that. Our method is very simple, and it will be integrated to our main public policies in construction. We are in the SPIPA project, which is an EU project focused on helping countries to meet their compromises for the Paris Agreement. We are creating a methodology for the database. The MME is in the general coordination of the project. The CBCS is overseeing the execution. We have the participation of sectorial associations as well. And here we have the structure of the project. We have the consulting committee, the executive committee, international partners, BPIE is among them. We have a scientific committee as well, which brings together specialists from Brazil. And we have the executing team. So here we have the logos of the different teams. Here the executive committee, the consulting committee, and now the scientific committee. And that's it. Thank you very much. We are starting a new journey now. Perhaps we are 20 years late, but it's good to get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor John. As you say, well, it's better to start late than never. And I'm sure that the change will accelerate now, because you have pointed out the urgency to address climate change. You have shown in your introduction how the world is being impacted very, very heavily by climate change already today. And I am quite convinced that the presentations which we have heard today are already a sign that the awareness and the willingness to change, in particular in the construction sector, is increasing, and that people are increasingly taking action. And what kind of actions should be taken is something we will discuss a little bit more in a moment in the panel discussion and in the Q&A session. I would like to thank everybody for the many questions which we have received already. We have a long list of questions which we're just preparing and which we will address in a moment. But for now, we have planned a very short break of just about 10 minutes. We'll make it a little bit shorter. I would like to ask you all to come back literally in 6 minutes, because then we stay right on schedule. So we will start again in 20 minutes to the hour. That is meaning in 6 minutes from now. So just a short break, and then we will continue with the panel discussion, and we will cover all the questions which we have received so far from you. So just a short break. Thank you, and see you in a moment again. So, welcome back, everybody. After our quite short break, I have to admit, but I hope you're all back. Welcome back to the second part of the exchange between the European Union and Brazil on the experiences in environmental performance assessment tools and policies for the construction sector, with a focus on life cycle analysis, on environmental product declarations, on the question, how do we manage the embedded carbon in construction materials? How do we reduce the embedded carbon and the climate impact of construction materials? And this webinar is organized by BPIE in collaboration with the European Commission, with the German Federal Environmental Ministry, and also with the Brazilian Ministry for Mines and Energy. And the context for this webinar is actually the so-called SPIPA, and that's an acronym which stands for the Strategic Partnership for the Implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is an initiative launched by the European Union and is one which is implemented by GIZ, the German Development and International Collaboration Organization. And I'm actually very grateful for the great collaboration which we had in the preparation of this webinar with all the parties which I just mentioned. We now have almost an hour to have a deeper discussion on the questions raised and to cover the many questions we have received so far through the chat. And I would like to invite our expert speakers back, and I see you all have your camera on already. That's fantastic. So we have Professor John again, we have Roland Hunziker from WBCSD, Mr. Maringolo from SEM Bureau in Brussels, we have Scholl Todd from BPIE, and we have John Driesen and Tom de Boer from the Dutch National Environmental Database. And before we go into the questions which we have received from the audience, I would like to start with a question, well, both to Professor John and Roland Hunziker. And I'm wondering whether you see that the discussion about net zero carbon targets and the discussion about increasing regulations is already driving innovation really in the construction sector. Do you see innovation becoming a mass market phenomenon in the construction sector, or do you rather see it being picked up by some leading companies, but by rather a small number of companies? Professor John, what's the situation in Brazil in this aspect? If you can just give us your indication, your opinion on that.
I think innovation is never a mass thing. You know, innovation is always a thing that I will say comes from an elite, you know, the guys with a vision and with the means. What we have in Brazil now is growing and very large numbers of startups in construction sector. I think it has been seen worldwide. And I also think that there is a motivation on the industry, especially from the building materials producers. Currently, we have 2 projects in our university that together they have like 43 companies between building contractors, designers, material producers, and these companies are working together with us to identify possible innovation opportunities. So yes, there is a great deal of excitement on innovation in construction, and I have to consider that perhaps the environment is not in the top yet.
You mean the environmental issues are not in the top yet?
No, so the environmental agenda is not in the top of the priorities for innovation from the Brazilian industry in this moment in the construction. Mm-hmm. So it is, they are excited about innovation. There's a big problems of productivity and quality, but it's for the building material producers like cement and steel. They are big companies, international. They have this agenda very clear, but for the downstream market, this is not very clear. The green building in Brazil didn't penetrate as well. Very expensive. The models from the LEED and others cost a lot of money. So many people think in the building sector that they cannot afford LEED, and therefore they can do nothing. And we have to change that. And I think CDAC is one way to show people they can do it. They can save environment every day, making the right decision, picking the right supplier, selecting the best material. That's what we want to do.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to CDAC in a moment because I have some questions on that instrument in particular. But Roland, how do you see the situation with your membership? Well, I think your membership probably consists of the companies who have the ambition to lead rather than to follow. But you also hinted when you presented the project that it wasn't necessarily easy to run the project and find all the data. So how do you judge the situation with your experience?
Data is certainly the issue, and that's why it's great to have this conversation. But maybe just to come back to net zero and innovation, definitely to have a clear target will drive innovation, because you know where you need to get, and then by innovating and collaborating, you can drive towards it. But as Wanderley says, it is still a few who are pushing for that. It is the leaders. You gave the example of Holcim with their new product in Brazil, where they say, well, you can have a 30% reduction, 70% reduction of the footprint of our product. It's very nice, but who will buy it? Does it cost more? Is there a demand for it? So I think that's why it needs all stakeholders to want to drive to that same common vision of getting to net zero. And that includes also, net zero means we have to reduce as much as possible emissions before we look at any compensation measures.
Antes de observarmos outras formas de
compensação. The whole life cycle. So I think the short answer is yes, it will foster innovation. I would agree, Wanderley, that a lot of innovation still does not focus enough on environment. And that's because it's still not being taken into account enough in the financial decision-making. And the data is still an issue to actually be able to compare the claims.
Okay, thank you very much. John, you mentioned earlier, if I have not misheard you, that the Dutch government will introduce mandatory requirements in the very near future. How has that been accepted or maybe debated by the Dutch construction industry? And one of the questions which we have received from the audiences here, I have it on my second screen here, is whether you think that it is essential to have mandatory requirements and legislation to really drive the decarbonization of building materials.
I think the construction environment in the Netherlands is taking very well the regulations. They are doing a very, very good work in the Netherlands. I don't see any problems in that way. But to give an example, to make a connection with the zero, to go to zero emission, now the rules are, the way how we calculate it, the rules says that for housing, you have to have an environmental performance of buildings of 0.8 euros per square meters per year. Yeah? And for offices, 1. Yeah? About our analysis and our experience, we see that in that way, there is no, in the way how we build at this moment and how we design, we have no problems with that. It's very easy to reach that rule. The rule will go lower. We expect about maybe 24, 27 to get the lower, to go to 0.5. we expect actually that at that moment will be more tough for designers and contractors to reach the goal. Yeah. And what we see right now, for example, by certifications of BREEAM, they use also our data, and they make some rules about the environment performance of a building. In some certifications, they make a regulation of 0.5 euros per square meter per year. In that way, what I hear from architects now, that begins to start the difficulty to design a building in that way. And what I hear from designers and builders, starting from that point, then if you don't change the way of designing, and if you don't look for better performance of materials, then it's not easy to reach it. And then if this goes to zero now, then I think that the mentality of designing and building have to change. Now we are just starting in a transition moment of the whole issue of that we are working now so hard.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor John. You said earlier in your comment that the environment as such is not very high on the agenda of the Brazilian construction sector. That is a general statement. It's probably not true for each and every company, but it's also not a very positive statement when we look at the environmental challenges which we have ahead of us. Do you think that it requires stricter regulatory measures in Brazil, or what kind of pathway could you see in Brazil?
I really believe that as anywhere, people need incentives. Everybody wants to change, but nobody wants to do the change, because wanting to change is very positive, but doing the change is hard. So industry needs incentives. I think we are going to need a sort of incentive, or a combination between incentive and regulation. The tradition in the last few years, we have had very good results applying incentives using public the governmental contracts, building contracts, as an incentive to move companies towards better quality. And that, I think this sort of things, if you can integrate environmental agenda in the housing projects, in the infrastructure projects, we are going to move the big part of the sector. I think this is faster, and it will face less reaction from the public. There are, I think we had in the past very few very good results. For instance, on waste management in building sites, reducing material wastage at the building sites, huge success, because they have economical implications. It makes sense to save both. And I also think that the new generation, the people that are coming into the market now, they are much more sensitive, much more concerned about environment than the old guys like me. But I'm pretty sure that the signs that the environment is sending to us, and the international pressure, and with the right governmental policy, we can do a very fast change. I agree.
Mr. Maringolo, you know both markets. You know the Brazilian and the European market. And you are, of course, you're based in Brussels, so you are engaging in the policy discussion here as well. What's your perspective? Do you think some of the policy experience could be transferred to Brazil? Do you think that Europe needs clear regulations beyond the voluntary scheme of levels about which you talked earlier? What's your perspective on that?
It's good to talk about Brazil, but that's we are facing a lot of changes now in the EU in terms of policies, and the sector is taking up the responsibility and doing the best. Environment is actually now, and it has been for a long time, the driver for changes and for innovation, and there's a lot coming up. But I think that we are facing issues that Vanderlei has also mentioned in terms of innovation and take up by the market. We had, for instance, low carbon cements that are in the market that are not sold. So there must be something to incentivize people to constructors to use these materials, and then we can actually be the example for Brazil. I'm not so much aware of the market in Brazil in these terms, but Brazil has always used a lot of additions to cement. So the cement has always been quite, let's say, there has been this driver. Right? It's an economic driver, but in the end, it's an environmental driver to use additions to cement to replace clinker. This is a trend that is different across the EU in different member states. But I think that we also have things to learn from both sides. But in terms of construction, it's true that we have more and more these certification schemes. We have some mandatory tasks like energy efficiency now that's coming up, and also embedded carbon is pretty much in all the discussions. We as the cement, and I speak for the concrete sector as well, we want to see the reductions across the value chain. So as I mentioned, the roadmap that Sambureau has published actually sees reductions along the value chain. It's what can be done at clinker production, what can be done at cement production in terms of additions to it, what can be done in terms of cement in concrete and concrete in construction. So there's a series of reductions that are possible to be done, but across the value chain. And put away the focus from cement and see what can be done along the value chain. And I think that this approach can be actually inspired, can inspire Brazil and others. What can be done along the value chain.
Yeah. But you also said, of course, along the value chain, not necessarily focusing just on one part of the value chain, and definitely not focusing just on one construction material. But I understand you that in the end, we need policies and instruments to stimulate demand for low carbon or zero carbon products. Relying on voluntary commitments alone will not really mainstream those products and increase their market share significantly.
Yeah, because I think that, I don't know if it is actually what Vanderlei mentioned, but environmental issues the environment is the driver now for business, for all the sectors, for the construction sector. But the people that will use the materials, are they in the same direction? I think that they might need some incentives or some mandatory incentives to take this up.
Okay, thank you. Scholt, in your presentation earlier, you talked about the EU's plans and the roadmap and what might come up. What do you think? What can the European construction industry expect in terms of regulations and incentives to be agreed potentially in the EU? And is there something you would say, well, it would be interesting for Brazil to look very closely at what the EU is doing?
Certainly, yes. Thank you, Oliver. Well, I think what you just said, voluntary measures are certainly very important, because this is not just about legislation alone. Certainly will not be able to reach climate neutrality objectives by 2050. And if you just look at the climate neutrality objective at 2050, it may seem a bit distant and it may seem to be a bit abstract. Certainly, it provides a clear pathway for the industry to sign up to. But what I think what will be needed is that this 2050 climate neutrality roadmap is being translated also in something much more concrete, in a much more concrete strategy and action for the various value chain actors. And it's as has been said, sustainability is indeed about balancing very often conflicting environmental but also social objectives. So this sort of scaling down of what the 2050 carbon neutrality will mean for us will need to take place in collaboration with the policymakers as well as the stakeholders to basically to sort out what needs to be done by whom and by when. And a way to underpin this and to basically to have really like a fair distribution of the burdens, but also of the benefits from this. We really need to have a bit more empirical evidence base. And as Roland was saying, it's really important to have the right sort of data in place in order to know really how much we can expect, how much we can push in terms of the regulation. So this is what at least the EU is going to sign up to over the next 2 or 3 years. And this will, I think, will be the very exciting space to watch in terms of the EU policymaking and trends and developments, because this is the sort of work that will need to be sort of developed just to know what will be the policy roadmap, but also the technology and the industry roadmap. So, and it's very clear that, you know, all the actors will have a role to play in this.
Thank you very much, Scholt. I have some quite concrete questions coming from the audience, and I would like to address some of them before we go or continue with the discussion. Tom de Boer, I wanted to ask you a question because it's very specifically addressed to the example and the database you talked about. The question is, do Dutch companies provide primary data for all the flows required to calculate the 19 LCA impact categories? Or do you rather use secondary LCA databases? Can you talk about that? Thank you.
Yes, manufacturers do use secondary databases, but not on an LCA level, but more on a process level. So we have 2 types of data in the database, basically, which are divided in 3 categories, but these types are specific and generic data. And for the generic data, that's our own data, we mainly use the EcoInvent database, which is an international database. And it's managed by an association in Switzerland. And it is possible, it's allowed by the determination method for manufacturers to also make use of this database to get their LCA, to add this to their LCA to make use of this generic data.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have a second similarly technical question for Brazil, Professor John. The question is, well, there are actually 2 questions. One is on EPD, so on environmental product declarations. Could you quickly talk about how they work in Brazil and what the level is, what the status is of EPDs in Brazil? And a related question is whether the CEDAC database can be used in a whole building level context, and how the real use of a product can be analyzed and how that links to the overall carbon footprint of the building which is being analyzed. Is that clear enough? I'm paraphrasing the question.
Yeah, well, first things, environmental product, we don't have our environmental product declaration scheme in Brazil. We do have certification bodies issuing European, mostly, EPDs in the Brazilian market, using some primary data from the local companies sometimes having no primary data, just, well, database data. And it's very, very hard. I am engineer, so I understand a little bit about plants, industries. And it's if you look deep enough in the eco-invent, you are going to see that people are using 40 years old data from Switzerland to decide in Brazil today with a completely different scenario. It doesn't make any sense. So what we are with, well, but there's a good thing that we don't have the complete mess that are these product category rules that we have you have in Europe, because there are the product category rules in Europe are inconsistent. If you look to the steel PCR, you look to the cement PCR, you look to the wood PCR, and they don't match. I think World Business Council, Roland, I think, had a project a few years ago looking into that and is mainstreaming LCA in construction. So we don't have that. I think we can avoid that mistake. Second thing is, I do believe that a country like Brazil is better. We focus in simple things that we can afford. And I truly believe that CO2 and energy is the way to start. I truly believe it's the way to start. And we are going to have environmental performance product declaration, a very simple one for construction. We call it environmental performance just to make a difference from the traditional EPD, right? So associated to CDAC, CDAC will issue a simplified environmental performance declaration for each product. And this is in the beginning, it's going to have only the 2 items, not the 19. But the good thing is these 2 items, all these emissions in the company, in the direct emissions from the company, it will be mandatory to be made with primary data. And that's a big difference, because we want a company to inform something that they measure and they can therefore can control, not something they fish it in a database. I am a little bit skeptical of the database-based LCA that is, well, dominating worldwide. It's a very good business, but I'm not pretty sure if the best strategy to help us to take the bad producers from the market. And we desperately need that.
Thank you. Roland, would you like to react to that statement about, well, a European mess in inverted commas and the project the WBCSD ran?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're not responsible for all the disagreements that are happening around LCA at the moment. And I guess my answer would be, just because some of those may be scientific discussions around LCA, what to take into account, what not, is not agreed on, doesn't mean that the approach was wrong in terms of PCR EPDs. I do think this is the right approach. Now, you can say it's complex, and it would be interesting to see how you're breaking down that complexity and say, well, let's start with 2 issues and add others later on. It's definitely good that you're looking at primary data. That's absolutely important. And it's one of these incentives, as you say, that needs to be given to the industry to actually bring it. So what are those incentives? But just to go back to maybe the methodology issues, I mean, there's a lot of work going on at the moment to better clarify cement, steel, wood, you know, how do you account it in your LCA? Now, I can't solve that. That's a lot of experts discussing it. There is right now, the greenhouse gas protocol is being reviewed for land use and land use change. There is a road testing phase coming up. And that should help clarify the use of timber in different end-use systems, among them in construction. And we hope to run one pilot on that. So that's a debate. That doesn't mean the approach was wrong around PCR EPDs. I do think it's fundamental, because it's not just CO2. There's so many other aspects that also need to be taken into account.
you say there is a lot of work going on at the moment, but are you maybe concerned that the approach which is taken at the moment is again not inclusive and will, you know, come up with regional solutions? Is there a way to, you know, really collaborate between the different regions and make the whole process faster?
On methodology, there should not be different approaches in different regions. And I think the LCA discussion is a global one. It's maybe not as mature everywhere. I have a colleague who participates in many of these LCA discussions, but ultimately it is an expert discussion, and where there is no agreement yet, we have to accept that. The problem is that should not keep us from acting. And even though maybe the data is not so great, I agree, you have 40-year-old data or 20-year-old data, but well, that's what it is. So what can we do to incentivize everyone to give better data? And I'd like to come back to, I'm really pleased, Wanderly, that you put up that report on your own slide, the report that says a developer and investor should ask for this information. Whenever they do a project, they should have requirements at the very beginning, show the data, and look at your strategies, how you reduce emissions of that project, because that will give the incentive to the designer, to the engineer, to look up the downstream and ask that from the manufacturer. And the ones with the primary data will be better. But for that, you need a verification a verification methodology. And that's why EPDs are important, because they are verified, they're agreed based on standards that have been agreed on. And so, yeah, I think it's important that how do we create those incentives to improve this?
Yes, and you mentioned
in Scandinavia in this sense. No?
Sorry?
There are initiatives in Scandinavia, and as Zolt showed for Denmark, but there is also from Norway, from Sweden, where there is a system implemented, and they require this from the producers, and they use EPDs. So there are examples, and see how this can be taken up, and how this can be reproduced elsewhere, because actually Scandinavia is quite a particular part of the world, let's say, in many instances, but it's happening.
Yeah, thank you. So Roland, you said the financial sector could be a real driver in demanding the data. Scholl, do you see that happening in Europe? We have the discussion around the taxonomy, the so-called taxonomy, which defines what could or should be a sustainable investment. Yeah, what's the role of and the contribution of the financial service industry to the debate at the moment, which you see?
Yeah, I think that this is certainly a relevant question, because financial institutions, they will simply need to take on the role of driving the demand for decarbonization and for zero carbon buildings. And I think there is a growing recognition that there is a direct link between carbon performance, or environmental performance, if you like, and financial performance. Or simply put it, it's a way to mitigate financial and transition risks. So I think there is a gradual recognition of this. And there is also, coupled with the regulatory trend of essentially, like the taxonomy that you have mentioned, to come up with a common classification of what is a future-proof building, that will certainly move the market, because that is very important for the financial markets to recognize what is an asset which is future-proof and what is not. What is an asset which is aligned with carbon neutrality target, or it could be aligned at a certain cost, and what is which is not. And this should send out a very strong signal to the market, because essentially it is not yet the case, but it will creep into the way how finance will be available. So simply, if you have an asset which is built to carbon neutrality or carbon neutrality standards or goals, there will be finance available. If not, then finance will be much more expensive, or at the end, or will be probably not available. But today, one of the key issues is that the financial sector is struggling with recognizing a building which is climate proof. I mean, we have been talking about the availability of the data, the complexity of running a whole life carbon assessment or an LCA assessment. This of course comes with a cost. And if the construction sector is struggling with this, the financial sector has even less know-how and skills, of course, to do that. So it again brings back this the importance of relying on cross-sectoral collaboration and these information tools, which provide that sort of certainty, or the amount of certainty, because we all know that there is a lot of uncertainty, but financial sectors are dealing with risks and uncertainties all the time. This is their business, but they need to make sure, they need to assess how much uncertainty is there, so then they can price this in accurately.
Thanks a lot, Scholt. Now we have the database in the Netherlands, John, and you talked briefly in your presentation about the structure and the governance. But could you maybe describe to us what it really took to set it up, to start it up? Are there some key ingredients which were absolutely essential to start it up? And are those key ingredients some which could be, potentially also found in Brazil to accelerate the process there?
Yeah, at first, one of the for us it's been important to create an independent organization, to have a support around the built environment. And this is completely important. That is the reason, because actually I don't know exactly how it came to how now is Nmd, but sure before we were a kind of organization, foundation that came directly from the government, and at that moment that organization were keeping the regulation and the database, and in that way you cannot be you cannot take decisions and permit decisions. A kind of you cannot be there's a kind have two kind of heads in the whole environment, and that is the reason that we came independent. So there was at first a good step, and we trying in through the committees to have enough enforcement in the built environment. In that way, we, for example, the policy committee is built about 3 groups. Each group is represented by 6 organizations. It means there are 18 organizations voting in this committee to give advice to Nmd. And important. And the 3 organizations were representing all the built environment. In one group, how I mentioned, there are the users of the data, like engineers, everybody is building and designing. The other is we give the contractors, all these companies, they giving contractors, or they are public or they are private. And local organizations, local governments also are represented there, and the third one, the people is providing the data. All the branches or organizations, they are represented by water organizations, by cement organizations, by the installation organizations. All are there represented. In that way, we try to have enough support in our mission, what we are doing. Secondly, it is very important what the Professor van der Leyen, John was saying about incentives to get in the data. And we are working in that way, trying to get subsidies in different levels. For example, in one way, every project that project can have a kind of subsidies if they use our data, primary data as well. And in other ways, we try to get new primary data in our database, trying to motivate fabricants and producers to get to make LCAs and try to have support about the government there, and trying to actually literally pay those LCAs to make it more easy and more sure the way to come to our database.
Yeah, thank you. So clearly the government's support is essential, is key, and the incentives which are provided. Professor John, I have a question related to that, a little bit directly addressed to you, coming from the audience. And the question is how you see the effort which is done right now by you and others in the next few years for designers to be able to automate some part of their analysis and to use that information. How likely is that going to be in the foreseeable future? And to what degree is that actually already possible in Europe and is done in the Netherlands, really?
We have, of course, we don't have that market yet in Brazil, but we already have one carbon and energy platform, web platform that allows building contractors, architects to do the estimative. Of course, we are working with them. Carbon, it has been supported by GIZ as well. We are working with them. We are going to supply for them the primary data that we are going to collect. So that's an ongoing process. We also been in conversation with the Bim BR, is the Brazilian Bim platform that is working on the methodology and you have all the regulation that we have to use this, enforce the use of BIM projects in public tendering and things like that. So we are going to be compatible with them. And our database has been designed in a way that will be possible to easily integrate with the BIM database, a public BIM database we are going to have in Brazil. And from that on, we expect the private developers of software to integrate inside of the BIM and the other models better tools. Our primary role is to attract data, validate data, and easily disseminate the data in the society. It's going to be accessible free of charge. And then we are open to collaboration to companies or organizations, whatever. I think this is a crucial thing. It has to be easy. If you have to hire a consultant to do a CO2 footprint estimation, or it's not going to happen because you are adding costs. So you have to make things automatic and clear. And we are 100% aligned on that. But we are not going alone to solve everything. We have to have focus.
Okay, thank you very much also for raising the question or the topic of BIM, because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which came from the audience, whether you think that the integration of life cycle analysis and building information modeling can really accelerate the uptake of LCAs. And I think your straightforward answer would be yes to that question, right?
Absolutely. I think in the end, the BIM that we are seeing now is just a draft, what the potential. It can integrate structural design, everything inside of the platform. And I think environmental, if you have the data and our data will be available, this is going to be very straightforward. I don't think next year, perhaps, or in 2-3 years, to have this integration working. I'm pretty excited about that. I think it's very good.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Roland, I have a very direct question to you related to your presentation and the scenarios you presented. So we need to go back to that as well. And the question is actually, so in the scenarios you presented, if it's not possible to really bring down the emissions to zero, what is the role of offsetting here? Or is there a role of offsetting in your scenarios? How did you take that into account?
I think offsetting clearly will play a role as well. As you say, some emissions are very hard to abate, and that may be inside the value chain or outside. So again, to the discussion before, emissions reduction has to happen across the whole process. But I think today there is a confusion between what is called offsetting in terms of helping someone else reduce. With that, you're not compensating, you're not neutralizing. And we have to come to a debate that is very clear. You reduce or you help neutralize, either in your own process through CCS or something else, or with nature-based solutions somewhere else. So I think that debate is still settling. It's definitely on the table. WBCSD issued a report about a year ago or two that natural climate solutions can bring 37% of the solution, but it is all about the quality of this work, which is very, very important, because we cannot say, oh, it's hard to abate, so we're just going to invest into natural climate solutions. So it's a tricky debate, but it is part of the equation. And again, the example Wanderley showed from the Holcim EcoPact, the max, or I don't know how it is labeled, the very last one uses neutralization by investing into natural climate solutions. So again, it's about the transparency of that solution, about the verification behind the claim, and then it is part of the game. But to say again, we can reduce today by at least half without changing anything, just by focusing. Obviously, having the data, that helps. But just very last comment, because we're coming up with time. RMI and Skanska just issued a report about 2 weeks ago in the US. They did some studies on several buildings projects. They were able to reduce 40% of upfront carbon, and it cost them a bare percent more. Now, you can say 1% is too much, but to show almost cost equality, and you have 40% less carbon. It's possible today.
Okay, and that is a report by the Rocky Mountain
Institute, RMI, and Skanska.
Okay, so if people would like to look into that report, I think if we Google Rocky Mountain Institute and Skanska, that report could be easily found. Scholt, I see you have your hand raised. I think you want to comment on that topic as well.
Exactly. I just wanted very quickly to chime in, because I think by taking on the whole life carbon agenda by the industry and by policymakers, we are essentially opening up the scope of all the possible mitigation and carbon management issues. So we are no longer, and solutions, we are no longer looking strictly at energy efficiency, renovations, and strictly speaking, energy performance targets. But we are looking at also at wider measures, such as improving lifespan of buildings, improving flexibility, adaptability, and all these questions, which are really, and all the profound questions probably which would need to be asked even before deciding whether to build or to renovate, is a question such as, do we need to build, how much we have to build, and where to build? And all these questions will need to be looked at from a much more comprehensive way, and then you will have probably a bit more leverage as well to play around with the sort of pyramid of the priority of the measures that you will need to have to reduce the carbon that Roland was talking about as well, that essentially offsetting on-site or near-site is the very last resort. So you will have to make sure that you are really exploiting all the potential solutions and measures which can reduce whole life footprint of buildings.
Thank you. Mr. Maringolo, I see you have opened your microphone, and it looks like you would like to react to that topic as well. I'd be happy to invite you to come in.
We are following up all these discussions in view, and all this embedded carbon is actually something that hits the cement industry quite a lot. because it's actually a sector that's, as Roland said, and that it's a very difficult, and I can say it's a very difficult sector to abate. So we'll really count on technology, and technology has drawbacks, as well, like CCS that you just mentioned. This will increase the energy consumption, but on the other hand, energy should be green. So we are all in this circle that we are, increasing something, but it should be clean there. But we have to see where this circle will actually close and get the net zero. So yeah, we're pretty much a sector that is on the spot for all these discussions, and we are striving to get to this road to net zero.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're slowly coming to the end of our time. We said we want to close the latest, and I think 8 minutes from now. I would like to use these remaining minutes to ask you all the same question and ask you for just a very quick statement. If you had a wish free to accelerate the take-up and the dissemination of life cycle assessments and therefore also the reduction of embedded carbon emissions and gray energy, what would it be? Do I have a volunteer who has very little time to think about the answer to start?
I can start, but if I may.
Please go ahead. Always good to have somebody
we are actually, our motto, and not only from the cement and concrete sector, but we are aligned with other construction materials producers, is whatever is done, it's done on the basis of material neutrality and not benefit one material over the other. Because in the end, if we think of life cycle, and if we think of the assessment, the whole life cycle, we should not do the preference to one or the other before we get to these results.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I ask the next volunteer to give me their feedback and their opinion, I would actually like to ask all the people in the audience, all the participants, to briefly turn on the camera. And the reason why I'm asking you is that we would like to take a few screen prints. This is an online meeting, so we don't see you in the audience. And though it is a replacement for a physical meeting, it is always a meeting which you have a little bit in the dark. So it's great to see you all. We want to take a few screen prints, and it will take a few seconds because we have quite a number of you joining. So thank you very much. If you really feel totally uncomfortable with having your picture taken, absolutely okay, then just leave your camera off. But thank you very much for doing that. That's much appreciated. So who's my next volunteer in answering the question? Roland? Yes. Sorry.
Sorry, Wanderley, go ahead.
No, go, Roland,
yeah.
Please.
No. You mentioned before BIM and the use of all this information. Today, it's very techy. You do it sometime at the end of a project. You really have to do it at the very beginning. So I think where digitalization has a huge potential is to help us integrate the life cycle thinking at the very beginning, when you have most choices in terms of design. And as you say, do you have to build? If so, how? So that would be my biggest wish for this.
Okay, thank you. Professor John?
No, I think I will bet on actual benchmarks of carbon footprints of buildings, not only in the use phase. We have been working in Brazil doing energy use in the building phase, in the use phase. But I think if you put benchmarks, if you put numbers, people can react. If architect could be able to say, okay, what I'm designing here is going to be, well, tremendously inefficient in terms of global warming because it used too much materials. And these are simple design decisions that, as Roland mentioned, you have to start right to go right. But the problem that we have, we don't have in Europe, we don't have everywhere, and these LCA databases we have, we don't have benchmarks. I did a benchmark for concrete CO2 footprint in concrete, and like 10 years ago. And it was the first benchmark in CO2 footprint for concrete. And it helped us a lot and helps the market. Czechoslovakia, China, they use my graph to benchmark their own concrete locally. So I think benchmarks are tremendously important. And we don't have environmental benchmarking in construction, in buildings, roads, bridges, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Benchmarks will stimulate competition, and competition is always good for innovation. Excellent. Thank you very much. Who's next in the list? Volunteers?
I can go as well.
Good,
because
please, thank you.
I agree, benchmarks would be great to have, but it's probably we are not there yet. So I would be just more modest in our wish, and I would just ask carbon and carbon metrics to be more widely recognized by both policymakers as well as the industry, and just create a bit of awareness, because this is probably where we come from. And really to start with simple things like establishing common carbon metrics, taking count of the bill of the materials which go into a building or into renovation, and just start from there. The benchmark will probably follow in 5-10 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Who from the Netherlands would like to go next? John or Tom?
Yeah, well, it can be me. I think that setting up an LCA can be quite an expensive activity for manufacturers. It may cost thousands of euros to set up an LCA. So I would like to ask for more financial support for startups in order to make that possible.
Thank you. John?
I would like to two things actually. One is implicit in our work is to have a bigger database. I think how much primary data we have, how stronger we are to reach our environmental goals, and every kind of efforts are welcome to get there. And the second one, I think that what I believe very good is the digitalization also. That is very important in very ways, in the communication, in the data communication, but also in the interface with BIM technologies and further. And I think, if I may say another thing, I'm curious, we are expecting a new regulation about the quality control of buildings. Now we are implementing the environment performance of a building in the design phase of a building, you know, to get a building license. But we expect from the next years, about next year maybe, to have these quality controls of the building project. Mm-hmm. That means that what you have to have for the building license, the regulations, you have to show it at the finish of the building. In that way, many people, builders, architects, engineers will be awake to reach their goals actually, and to find more and better materials.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for all your opinions, your ideas, and your contributions. That's much appreciated. And as I said earlier, we're very close to coming to the end. I would like to give the final word to a representative from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, but I don't know whether technology is working for us really at this point in time, and whether we have Alexandra Maciel with us. We had some technological challenges. Alexandra, are you there or are you not there? Or Lucas, would you have any update?
I'm here.
You are. Excellent. Well, then I would like to welcome you to give us the final words from the ministry's perspective. I know your role is to also coordinate and lead the SPIPA project and the collaboration between the EU and Brazil on that. So I'm looking forward to hear your perspective, how we have been doing today and what you think could be the next steps. Thank you.
Obrigada, Oliver. Can I switch to Portuguese, or do we still have translation?
We should still have translation. I think the translators are working tirelessly in the background. It should work. Please switch to Portuguese.
Thank you. Bom, obrigada.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I would like to thank all of the participants here. We had such a high-level debate. The discussion that has been stimulated here through the BPIE work is very important, and I think that today we created a bridge. It was a first step for this communication between institutions, and I hope that one of the consequences from today is the establishment of this more direct contact between institutions. And I hope Brazil can count on this support. As Professor Vanderlei said, we are late. We are off to a late start. But we can observe the European experience that has been developed over the years and use that for our development. So over this morning, I have listened to all of your experiences and this exchange. And I think we do have a lot of consolidated experience from what I have heard here. And I think this is very promising for Brazil to count on this experience. The Ministry of Mines and Energy would like to thank, you all on their behalf. Thank you for your work. Thank you, BPIE. Thank you to all our supporters, the SPIPA project. And I would also like to thank the European Committee, the German government, who have contributed to the SPIPA project and the support that we have received here with GIZ, which is a great partner of ours. So I just want to thank you all. The ministry's doors are open to other discussions, and I think we can continue with this, speak of all of this relating to other subjects, and we are totally open to this dialogue. So I want us all to continue with this process. This is not just work, it's really something that we are working towards in sustainable development and bringing that to civil construction. So it's so important to get to know our colleagues, their work, because we are all in the same boat here. Thank you very much. And I am passing the floor back to you now, Oliver.
Thank you very much for your kind words and for the invitation and the openness to continue. I think in these times where we're all often still locked up in our countries, international exchange is becoming even more important. And I think we had a wonderful start here. I would like to thank everybody who was involved. I mean, we only got to know each other literally in the past few months. And I think the collaboration between the ministry, between GIZ, between the many, many partners on all sides has worked extremely well, and I'm very grateful, and I would like to thank you all. I also want to say again that the recording of this webinar will be made available, so we will share it more and more in the community, as well as the PowerPoint slides will be made available. And with that, I just want to close the meeting. I want to wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe and healthy, and we will be in touch and hear from each other soon again. So thank you all. Thank you to the team in the background who did a fabulous job in organizing that. Thanks to all the participants, the contributors, the speakers today. I wish you all the best. Greetings from Brussels, and until soon. Bye-bye.
Obrigado.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.